I'm Sheryl, I'll be your moderator, and with me is Natalie Black, the Trade Commissioner for APAC, for the UK, and we're looking forward to having a great discussion. So, Natalie, just to start off, a spot of news, something really relevant to your role. The UK is joining a trade agreement with 11 other countries, including Australia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan. Tell us a little bit more about this and what are the highlights and what we can expect.
Well, firstly, good morning, Sheryl. It's fantastic to be here, and hello, everyone. I always think I get these events wrong. I would much rather be sitting there eating breakfast rather than having to do the work here. So well done you for managing to get breakfast. It's a very exciting couple of weeks for the UK here in Asia Pacific. Just last weekend, we signed to join, and here we go, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is the most exciting trade deal in the world. We're delighted to be a new member. I've just got back from Auckland, where I was traveling with our Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, to sign. And the reason why we are so excited about this deal is not only that it's worth £12 billion and it is a market of 500 million consumers, but it's really setting the standards for how trade is going to happen, not just here in Asia Pacific, but around the world. That really leads us into the theme of this morning, because sustainability and green trade is at the heart of CPTPP. And before we go further, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all the parties, particularly here in Singapore, that was so supportive of the UK joining CPTPP. And as we look to our friends in Vietnam, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, I won't reel off all 11 other members, but it's quite exciting about what we can do together going forward on trade. And of course, for those parties that aren't members yet, we hope the deal will expand, but also it provides opportunities to collaborate in the region and drive the agenda around how do we work together on green trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Green trade. So I think one of the worries that businesses usually have when you have such trade agreements and trade flows is that with regards to sustainability, what happens if your standards are high and money flows, investment flows to countries or regions with a little bit laxer regulations? I mean, what do we do with that? Were these considerations when you were taking part in this trade agreement discussions?
So that's such a good question, Sheryl, because I think if we were having this conversation when I first started this job nearly 5 years ago, it probably wouldn't have come up, actually. The number one question I would usually get asked about trade deals in this part of the world would be around agriculture. That has fundamentally changed the last couple of years. People want to know, consumers and businesses, what trade deals are going to do for the green agenda, both the pros and the cons. And I think the challenge is for us as leaders is to make sure that trade deals are about raising all boats and not a race to the bottom. So how do we do that? Well, partly it's about the commitments we make. So the UK was the first country in the world to legislate for a net zero commitment. We all know how hard that is to deliver. We've just been hearing about that, but we have a commitment in Parliament that we will be held account to. And secondly, it's about how do we construct deals that incentivize and encourage good behavior upwards rather than, as I say, a race to the bottom. So when I look at the trade deal that we've done with New Zealand, for the first time, we had a standalone climate chapter, which recognizes the importance of inclusivity in trade, particularly in the involvement of the local indigenous community, the Maori community, but also puts front and center the pressure on government and business to make this a core part of everything that they do. Now that in some ways is the easy bit in terms of aspiration. Of course, we know there are challenges on the trade agenda, particularly when it comes to green issues. And the other question that I'm often asked when we talk about green trade is palm oil, of course, in this part of the world. Now, the UK is a relatively small importer of palm oil. It's only 1%. But we absolutely understand how important it is to economies in this part of the world, particularly in our friends in Indonesia and Malaysia. And when I'm in both of those countries, I'm always talking to businesses about how do we collaborate there. And we have fundamentally shifted how we import palm oil in the UK. So in 2010, about 16% of our palm oil imports were sustainable. As of about 2021, it's more like 74%. So I think there's also a responsibility on being intelligent consumers and importers to make sure that we can collaborate together, recognizing that there are local dynamics that we need to understand and be part of. So in summary, I say it would be a combination of, one, making sure that we are all aiming high and it's not a race to the bottom, because then trade deals don't work, but also having constructive relationships around some of the issues that can be more tricky, and we just need to be honest about that.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So I think one other key investment area is definitely clean energy in this region. And what does the UK think of investing in this theme here? I mean, what do you see this region as compared with other parts of Europe? What are the potential areas?
So again, I see that as a fundamental shift. When I first started talking to UK companies about what they wanted to do in Asia Pacific, there was a big focus on technology generally, but the last couple of years, green technology and sustainable infrastructure has absolutely rocketed up the agenda. That's where people see the opportunities, and I expect that's why you're all here this morning. What does that mean for the region, particularly here in Southeast Asia? I mean, the opportunities are clear because the fundamentals are right. When you look at places like Cambodia, actually it has the same solar intensity as Australia. And Australia has incredible plans to be a solar energy superpower. How do we support Cambodia on that journey as well? When you look back to the UK, Sheryl, your reference point, in the UK, we're the second largest producer of offshore wind, mainly down to the dynamics in the North Sea. But actually, those dynamics are very similar in the Philippines and the Vietnam in terms of the consistency of offshore wind availability. So actually, that's a huge opportunity. And I'm seeing some very, very smart investors recognizing that they can bring UK technology to Southeast Asia to speed up the taking advantage of those opportunities. And indeed, I'm seeing investment coming from this part of the world going into the UK to then bring the technology back here to Southeast Asia. And that, I think, shows how strong the partnerships are. So let me give you an example. Before the G7 in May, I went with my Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to Tokyo because we were announcing a huge package of investment, 18.5 billion from Japanese financial houses into the UK, predominantly in green technology and mostly in offshore wind. Why were Japanese investors doing that? Because they know that this is a strength of the UK. And they want to not only make some money, as good investors do, but also learn how we've done it, get early insight to that technology, and then bring that technology not only back to Japan, but also to Southeast Asia. So we see the opportunity for the forming of lots of new partnerships, similar to what I was saying around CPTPP in terms of we're deepening our friendships all the way across the region. But we're making it very practical, particularly in the green energy space, because opportunities are one thing, and we sort of touched on this earlier, but actually actioning them and doing something about it takes partnerships and money and commitment.
Right. So we talked about renewable energy. One of the key hurdles for that in this region is grid infrastructure. And that's really what is needed for renewable energy to scale up and properly take off. So how does the UK see that? Because grid infrastructure has typically always been in the domain of the public sector and governments. What can private investment do? Is it a good investment? Tell us more.
So it's definitely a good investment. I'm not at all going to pretend the UK's got this completely right, because for us, it's still one of the challenges in the supply chain in terms of particularly the last stages of getting transmission right, particularly in the context of offshore wind. But because it's been a learning journey for us, I think it means that when we look at new projects, it's given us a really good insight to what are the challenges going to be and trying to plan for those early. So particularly in this kind of context, it's one of the reasons why we have set up our ASEAN Green Catalytic Framework and Fund. The UK, was made a dialogue partner in ASEAN 2 years ago. So we're the first new dialogue partner of ASEAN in 25 years. And we are really, really committed to this relationship. And one of the feedback points we always hear is what can we do to support on green energy, and particularly in terms of setting up new infrastructure. So this fund is actually part of a wider ADB fund and provides an opportunity to blend finance. But in effect, it's 0% loans exactly for these kinds of initiatives alongside technical assistance. Because, again, one of the feedback points we always hear in the region is, yes, money is important, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that here, but money is one thing. You have to put it alongside technical assistance and also ensure that you don't push out private financing, which of course is where many of you come in. So maybe we can touch on that a little bit more, but we are trying to make sure that there's not only money available exactly for those kinds of projects, but it sits alongside good advice and also opens up private financing.
Right. So what Natalie was talking about, this UK ASEAN catalytic green finance funding, it's a 134 million fund. And how much has been used? How much has been dispersed already? And what do you want in terms of impact? So for every dollar that you are going to be dispersing, like how much private sector money do you intend to crowd in?
So this is all being worked through at the moment. I need to be a little bit careful in terms of what I can say publicly. But ultimately, this funding will only go alongside private funding as well. It's blended. And the most important factor is that we want to back projects which are identified by the governments in whichever market in ASEAN wants to take this forward, and that they personally back. Because it's not for us to necessarily say which are the right projects. As I say, we can provide advice and guidance and experience from what we've learnt in the UK, but it's absolutely not for us to pick the projects. So what we're asking governments in ASEAN to do is to come forward with proposals. And ideally, we want to see those which not only, of course, ask for support from the UK government, but also lean on the additional funding from the ADB, and of course demonstrate how they're going to crowd in private sector funding. So we're not setting targets at the moment, but a key test is that we should be at the stage of risk, basically. What we are happy to be the first mover to make projects less risky, but ultimately we want to see private financing coming in behind, because that's what's going to make the projects more sustainable, pardon the pun.
Right. So speaking of a mix of public and private funds, definitely we have to talk about the just energy transition partnerships. It's something that Melissa made reference to earlier as well. So there are three. There's South Africa, there's Indonesia, there's Vietnam. Let's talk a little bit about Indonesia. It's pretty relevant for this part of the world. You know, as a reporter, we have been speaking to various parties on this issue, and the consensus seems to be that JETP is moving along a little bit more slowly than people would like. Of course, there are many parties involved. There's the private sector, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and there are all these governments, you know, Japan, US, the UK is one, right? So tell us a bit, Natalie, about how you're seeing JETP and what are the sticking points?
So I'm really glad you brought this up, because the JETP framework is something that we championed as part of our presidency of COP26. And we have seen it work really, really well in South Africa. But when you're doing things that are relatively new and innovative, they do take a bit of time. So in a South African context, it took just over a year for the investment plan to be developed. And we're on a similar time frame, I think, for Indonesia. So it's not a case necessarily of sticking points. It's actually the fact that, particularly in terms of how the framework operates, the heavy lifting needs to be done at the development of the investment plan, because that's when you get all parties on board. So I think we're optimistic that we'll be able to say something soon, but I'm absolutely delighted that we're focusing on Indonesia. I think there's some very exciting things that we're going to be able to do together. But in terms of sort of headline numbers, we're going to have to wait a little bit to see how that all plays out, because it's a live negotiation and wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment. But when you look at the reference point in terms of South Africa, there was a huge difference between what we initially thought we could do in South Africa and the actual final amount in terms of a multi-billion-pound package. So I think we obviously have the same aspiration for Indonesia, but let's see how the negotiation goes.
Right. So the thing with these partnerships, this agreement, is that what you're doing is really helping very coal-dependent economies transition to a greener economy in a just way that doesn't leave people behind. But with coal, there's always this concern by some, especially investors in Europe, about greenwashing. So what are some safeguards that we need to look at to make sure that this doesn't become an issue?
Sheryl, you're asking all the best questions, because this is probably the trickiest issue. Again, particularly in the context of Indonesia, as many of you know, Indonesia has some of the youngest coal plants in the world. Some are as young as 15 years. So it's quite hard to have the conversation around how do you incentivize a transition away from coal when the investment's been made so recently. But that's certainly the conversation that we're having. I mean, I think the wider context is also one to be recognised. Again, from a UK perspective, of course, we recognise how tricky the energy supply debate has been over the last couple of years. I don't think any of us necessarily saw what was coming in terms of the implications of the war, the illegal and unjust war in Ukraine, and what that would mean for the world out here. And of course, that's the context and perspective that many investors and businesses are looking at the just energy transition. But this is all about how we green finance. It's about supporting the transition and the difficult journey to ensure that there isn't a cliff edge. It's not necessarily just about new products and new ways of doing financing.
Right. So in supporting the transition, can you share a range? Maybe, like, I understand no headline figures, but how much is the UK committing?
So in terms of the JETP programs, I can certainly say it will be over £1 billion. All of this is to be confirmed, but I'm just reminding myself of the South Africa figures. Initially the expectation was 8.5 billion for the South Africa plan, and it ended up being 98 billion. So I'm not at all suggesting that that's necessarily where we're headed for Indonesia, but it gives you a context of what's possible, and we would want to see the same level of ambition, and the UK is very keen to play its part.
Right. So over £1 billion, that is for all the JETP programs? That is for Indonesia, or?
All of them, but to be specified in terms of allocation.
Right. So any figures on how much like Indonesia would get?
I feel like I'm negotiating here live on stage. You're going to get me in trouble,
curious.
Sheryl.
We need to know.
This is why you're so good at your job. No, I really can't. I mean, all of these business people here will tell me don't negotiate live on live on stage. So I won't say much more. But look, these are big figures, right? But it's really important. I go back to my previous point. This isn't all about government money, because as we know, that doesn't work. This is actually about how you do blended finance. And it's really, really important that government investment doesn't push out private finance, that we actually find the projects that are more trickier for private finance to do, and that we go in early, but bring the right partnerships in behind us. And ultimately, that is what will deliver the financial returns for everyone, but most importantly, will get us closer to our net zero commitments.